Hey, welcome to our online church service. My name is Josh Carsonson. I'm the lead pastor here, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us and checking us out. If you are newer to Northwest Hills and you're just trying to see what we're all about, this is a really cool, easy avenue to watch, to see what's happening, and this is a nice first step to joining us on a Sunday. If you are a part of our church family and you're very familiar with us and you are out of town for the weekend, you got a fun vacation, you got a job thing, or you're sick and you can't make it on Sunday, what a cool way that you can watch a church service later throughout the week. But if this is something that you're doing in replacement of Sunday morning gathering, we would just encourage you, as Scripture says, don't forsake the weekly gathering. Join the people. This gathering where we're worshiping God, where we're hearing from His Word, where we are connecting with one another is really pivotal to what it means to belong to a church. And so we would invite you, come on a Sunday morning. Again, thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoy this service as it helps you in your process of loving Jesus, living like Jesus, and making Him known.
Good morning. Well, like Pastor Josh said, my name's Jacob Mills. I'm the pastoral resident for this year. Really blessed to be here, first off, that I get to spend a lot of time both with Ron and Josh. They get to pour into me, and I just get to learn and see how God uses that in my life. And being up here this Sunday is kind of an outpouring of that I get to share what I've been learning a lot, and that happens to be going through the book of Esther. But I was just thinking about the new year, he was talking about how many people would actually stay up. I think in the lobby beforehand, we were raising hands to see how long people had stayed up. I think the longest was 2:30. It's funny, in previous years before marriage, I think last year actually, I stayed up till like 6 a.m., 7 a.m. I don't think I went to bed, maybe. It's funny how much marriage changes you, because last night, 11 p.m., I was in bed and I was ready to go. And, exactly, yeah, that's not a bad thing in some cases. My wife is very vocal, which is a good thing because sometimes I need that. And she makes it very well known what she wants to do. And, we come to a nice middle. It's part of marriage. I've learned a lot. It's cool to see how God works in different stages of your life, for sure. So, getting into the book of Esther as we're going into today. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, so last week was Christmas, the week before that, Josh took us through the book of Nehemiah, which, if you remember, he had canonically said that is the end of the history of the Old Testament, meaning that from the events of Nehemiah, where we're left with Nehemiah praying that God simply remember him, that is where, after that point, we don't hear anything from God for 400 or so years? It's crazy how we come to that point. So, coming into today with the book of Esther, where are we going from here? Well, the books that come from Esther up until Malachi we're going to be taking a more in-depth dive of the books we do. If you think before, we were sky high in the sense that we were looking at the whole of history, and now we're going to be taking deep dives into the more specific parts of history, and that's starting today with the book of Esther. Now, again, like I said, we last left the chosen people trying to rekindle the fire that they had with God beforehand, and what we're left with was Nehemiah saying, "You know what, God, just remember us. We're broken. We need something. Where are we going from here?" And up until this point, that's been the theme throughout all of this, and we're going to continue on in this theme. Today's story is going to center mostly around an almost tragedy that could have happened to the chosen people, where during these events, all of the characters, even the good guys, had pretty morally ambiguous ethics, at best. We're going to see good people, bad people, people who hate God, people who we don't even know how much they really care about God in that case. And ultimately what we're going to be left with is, where is God in all of this? This is a very unique book in the sense that not once during this entire book do we hear God's name. We see they're mentioned the Jewish people, the Jews, the heritage, but we don't hear or see God's name proclaimed during this entire book, which is funny just in the case. It's like, all right, intern preaching his first time here at Northwest Hills, let's give him the book that doesn't even mention God. That's a good way to start with, But in all seriousness, I think what we're going to learn as we go through this book is that while we see a book full of broken people doing a lot of things, ultimately what we come away with is a God who can use these broken people to further his plan. That even through all the brokenness of the world, through all the moral ambiguity, through all the messiness that comes with our culture and people around us, God still works and his plan continues. But even in all of that, what is going on during the story, right? So if you'd like to jump, we're going to jump right into it. If you open your Bibles and stand with me, we're going to be starting right at the beginning, Esther 1, verse 1, and we are going to be reading to the 12th verse. They're right here. Now in the days of Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. While he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness, for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. Imagine that. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his place to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abitha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the people with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Alrighty. So some background is kind of needed on this instance. How did we get here? Well, first off, we're going to see that this story is centered around the Persian capital of Susa. They call it a citadel in some areas. And your journal places these events, if you have them with you, around 400 AD, which places this particular story around the time of the rebuilding of the temple. So if you remember from what we talked about with Ezra and Nehemiah, King Cyrus gave an edict to all of his peoples, all the minorities actually in the kingdom, to go back to their place and rebuild what once was. It could have been to either rekindle some morale in the kingdom as in general. But what this meant for us is that the Jews in that area, the Jews who decided to, would go back to Jerusalem and start to rebuild the temple, as we see through Ezra and Nehemiah. They work on the wall, they work on the foundation, they work on the place of offering that people would come by. But this story isn't centered around the Jews who went back. This is centered around the Jews who decided to stay where they were at, and this being here in Susa. Now, another thing to take note of here is it mentions King Ahasuerus. Now, if you were to go back, be really diligent through the Chronicles and all the stories with the kings, you won't hear Ahasuerus mentioned, and that's for a reason. This is actually a Hebrew transliteration of the Greek name Xerxes. So when you see Ahasuerus, think of King Xerxes, who's a Persian king during that time. I believe he came after Darius, King Darius. That doesn't matter too much, just in the case that you can look back and be like, okay, Ahasuerus, Xerxes. Next thing, we see 180 days where they were partying and the king was trying to flex all of his power in a sense. He's trying to show his money. all the power that he had around him, whether that be through the army. And the reason he was doing this is because the king was about to go on a big, he was about to go fight the Athenian region. He was gonna go fight the Greeks. And he needed his friends and people around him to believe that he was powerful, he was still in control, he knew what he was doing. So he brought all of them here and he said, all right, this is what I got. I'm flexing my proverbial muscles and money just to get everyone on board, make sure that they know that we got this, we're going to win. He ends up not winning. So he does that for 180 days, and then for a week, he has this really, really big feast. And on the 7th day of the feast, after much drinking, obviously, he wants to see his wife, Queen Vashti. Now, we aren't given the exact reason why she rejected him. There could be a number of instances. It could be after 187 days of flexing that she was probably done, as most people will be. I've never had a party that's lasted more than 8 hours, and so I cannot imagine 187 days. That would be nuts. But I imagine it got quite a bit. So he asked for her to come, and the idea was kind of similar. He wanted to demonstrate the power, say, hey, this is the queen that you're fighting for. Look how awesome she is. She probably may not have wanted to be presented in such a manner. So either way, we don't get the exact background, but what we do know is that she rejects this offer, and what's left is, instead of getting a big morale boost that all the men around him would have, instead becomes a really big embarrassment for him, because now everyone around him is like, oh, you can't control your queen. What does that have to do with this? And so, to save face, what does he do? Well, afterwards, later at the end of chapter 1, we see that he makes a decree that, one, Queen Vashti cannot be queen, and that there's going to be, that Queen Vashti cannot be queen, and then also that all men would be masters of their own household. So, a lot of information just went by. Let's take a little time out, though. There's a lot of things that have just gone on. We see a pagan king who's trying to save face in this case, and he makes some questionable decisions on how to rule his kingdom in the first off. We have to think about how Queen Vashti was feeling during this time. We don't know exactly what was going through her head. The story is very interesting in that the author goes through and gives details for all the events that happened, but we don't see into the head. We don't see into the mind. We don't see how each character was feeling throughout this entire story. And I think that's a really important piece to take away from, not to give exact judgments for where exactly we are. I feel like a lot of times nowadays we like to insert our own ideas, our own morals into the characters that we read. And in this case, it's an interesting study for sure, but we need to remember that as we go through this, to read the story for what it is, and go from there and make our decisions and judgments afterwards. But we don't see what's inside Queen Vashti's head, but all we know is that he makes reasonably a silly decision, and there's going to be some consequences that come from that. Right after this, though, the king realizes that he needs a queen to fill that spot, and so he sends for all of the young unmarried women in the kingdom to come and to have what is essentially a beauty pageant, kind of, with some more weird things attached to it. I'll keep it lightly because I know there's children in the audience. And so this is where we're introduced to our two main protagonists in this. That would be Mordecai and Esther. Now, Esther is the niece of Mordecai. The one thing to note that's really important about them is they're both Jewish. We're reminded that they're both Jewish. And as Esther comes into the place, she's brought into the harem, as it were, Mordecai gives her specific information, says, do not reveal your heritage to anyone. She has a Jewish heritage. Mordecai must have felt that would have been a detriment to her. Either way, again, we don't see into the heads of theirs, but he tells her to do that, and she follows through. Little time out here, again. A lot of information. We see a Jew who's brought into a Gentile nation. We see eventually this this Jewish woman, is going to be raised to a high amount of power here. She's going to be figured as the queen. But at the cost of she has to not reveal her heritage, the truth of where her background is and what she stands for. And we don't even see into the mind of what she's thinking through. Does this crush her as she has to hide her heritage? Is it all right with her? She gets to be in the palace. It's a pretty nice place, a little cooler than my little dinky apartment right now, I imagine. So, but we don't see into her head. We don't see what thoughts were going through her head. So it's all, you have to keep that in mind as you read through these stories, that we don't exactly know what these characters were thinking and what they were feeling. And that's very unique to this story just in general. So getting back to it, like I had mentioned, she's brought into this harem, and after 6 months of preparation, she goes in and sees the king. She assumedly wins, she wins through all of that, and she is raised to the level of a queen here in the nation. From one day, she's brought as some Jew, raised up into the kingdom, and now she is the queen of one of the most powerful kings of this era. Quite an elevation story, quite a glow up, that is for sure, in this time. So where do we go from that? Seems like it's been on a pretty good raise as of yet. Well, right after this event, a few things kind of happen. There's a little stroke of luck, I'll say. While there's a big party after the crowning of the queen, Mordecai, her uncle, overhears a few guards who concoct a plot to deal with the king in a way. They were looking to assassinate the king at one time or another. Mordecai overhears this plot from the guards. He immediately then goes to Esther, and Esther shares that with the king. The plot is foiled, and they're all good. One thing to note from this is that after all of this, usually there was an immediate reward. There was either money given or an elevation in status or something, but that did not happen, at least for right now. Nothing happens for Mordecai. He continues going on with his regular, everyday stuff. Instead, what happens is the very next day, instead of Mordecai being elevated, what we see is that our last character come into play, and his name is Haman the Agagite. Now, our character Haman here is going to be the central antagonist of the story. We'll see why in just a second. So, like I said, instead of Mordecai being elevated, what we see is the king elevating this guy named Haman. Haman is elevated to the number 2 person in the kingdom. That being, there's the king, your queen, and then Haman is up there, very, very high up. Now, after having such a promotion, in a way, Haman demonstrates quite a bit of pride in a way. I mean, as you might feel pretty good after being elevated to the number 2 in the kingdom, he has the power that he can pretty much do anything he wants besides what the king wants. And so on his way out, he makes it known that wherever he goes, he wants people to bow for him in one instance or another. Now, everyone complies with this except for one person, that being Mordecai. Now, again, we don't get the exact reason why Mordecai. It's implied that there's a religious difference. Obviously, he's a pagan, he's a Jew, he doesn't want to bow, but that's not explicitly shared. So we're going to take it as is. But either way, what we're left with is Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. And what does he do? Well, Haman's pretty salty about this bash to his pride. And instead of just taking this out on Mordecai, he ends up learning that Mordecai is Jewish. And instead of just, again, taking it out on Mordecai, he decides, you know what? I don't like all of Mordecai's people. And what he does, he goes directly to the king. And he asks that the king create a decree that would allow people throughout the kingdom to wipe out any Jewish person throughout the kingdom. Do you see it? I don't know if this quite strikes you as crazy. Have you ever had beef with someone, and so instead of just taking it out with that person, you decide to kill that entire person's lineage, search out all of their family members throughout all the world, and try and take them out? I don't know. I've never had that happen, thankfully. I hope that it doesn't ever happen to you. But we see that happen here. We see that Haman gets a decree, and he actually pays the king a little bit of money to get this through. And he gets a book on the boards and says, hey, on this day, which is divided by literally tossing dice, called a pur, on the 13th of Adar, we're going to rise up and smite out all the Jewish people. And he gets the king's stamp, puts it on, boom, it's in the papers. The next day that's sent out, all the people hear and see about it. Mordecai hears about it because he's at the place, and he's distraught. He's broken down. He tears all of his clothes off, puts the sackcloth on. Esther, when hearing about this, she sends one of her eunuchs to go out and obviously bring him back in. But in terms of our story, this is going to be the lowest point, as we see. Funny enough, this is about the halfway point. Right at the end of chapter 5 is where we find ourselves. We see that Haman's elevated, searching after all of the Jews' heads, and in this broken down state. Well, what's coming after this is a large rising action, in the sense that we're going to see how God flips the script on this. Watch this. So after bringing Mordecai in, we see that they both come up with some sort of a plan. And I would have loved to see what that plan comes up with, because it's an interesting plan to me. So Esther needs to get one-on-one with the king, or she needs to meet with the king. And so her plan is she's going to sit outside of the main, or she's going to sit in the main courtyard right outside of the king's throne and wait until she gets recognized. Now, this doesn't seem like a lot, but this is an incredibly brave action. Well, why? Well, in Persian culture, if the king did not want to see you and you ended up showing your face, he'd axe you. I'm annoyed with you. I don't want to see you. Why are you here? I don't want to see you anymore. That's pretty much how it went. So the only time you would come see the king was if he asked for you. Well, pretty much if he asked for you, or if he just happened to be like, you know what, I'm down to see you right now. Why not? Sure. So we see that Esther is outside in the courtyard, kind of idling by, and the king sees her and says, you know what, come on in. I'll talk to you. So she comes on in, and what's the big plan? What's the play? She asks that he come to a banquet with her, that she's going to prepare a banquet for him and Haman, and she wants them both there. All right, pretty cool dinner. I like food. I'd go to that. Why not? So right after that, we see the banquet scene. They're at this banquet scene. The king says, all right, there's something you want to ask me. What is it you want to ask me? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom. Like, just ask it. Easy. Go for it. And what does she ask? She asks, can you come to my banquet tomorrow? All right. I like free food. I'll go with it. Sure. And so the second banquet goes by, the first banquet goes by. There's a plan for a second banquet that next day. Don't know where the plan's going, but, there's got to be something on the horizon. So after this first banquet, continuing on, we see the acts of Haman. Now, Haman, again, he's feeling pretty high on himself. He just got elevated to the second in the kingdom. He's about to take out his enemy, feeling pretty good about that, and all of his enemy's people, so he doesn't have to deal with them ever again. He just had a personal sit down with the king and the queen. She specifically asked for him. Like, that seems pretty awesome. Feeling pretty high on himself. He makes his way home, and with his friends and his wife, he decides, you know what? I want to personally take care of Mordecai. I want to make it personal here. I saw him in the gate just a minute ago when I'm walking out. I'm sick of it now. I don't want to wait till the 13th of Adar. Let's just take care of it right now. And what him and his friends and his wife concoct is they decide to build a gallows. Now, I'm not going to stress too much what the idea of the gallows is, but from what I've seen in my studies, a gallows is essentially a big stick. Big stick that you put in the ground and you put people on it. Very simple. And they decided to build this big stick 70 feet tall. I'm looking at this. I'm like, all right, that's pretty tall. That's like taller than this roof right here. 70 feet tall. Big stick. I don't even know how they get this person on the stick. But they decide they build a gallows. They build a gallows right outside of his house. And they decide that in the next morning, Mordecai is going to go to the king, and he's going to say, you know what? This guy annoyed me. Let's put him up on the gallows. That's the plan. Not looking too good for our protagonists here. That is for sure. Well, moving forward, we see the next night, or this night, in between the first and second banquet. The king cannot sleep that night. And, you know, when you can't sleep, you got to have something to put you back. I know a lot of people like warm milk. I'll usually watch like a YouTube video, or like my wife will put on the Bible app and like let it play until we fall asleep. That's pretty good. That's essentially what the king puts on right here. The king brings forth one of his chroniclers and says, you know what? Start reading the Chronicles. I'll fall asleep. We'll be good from there. During this time of reading the Chronicles, what does he hear? He hears that, you know, not too long ago, Mordecai, this guy who sits in my courtyard quite a bit, he actually saved my life. There was a plot to kill me, and he usurped it, and his loyalty hasn't been paid. Like, we didn't do anything for that yet. He's like, well, we got to do something. Like, this, we got to pay this out now. So he goes to bed. The next morning, he's trying to figure out what to do with all this. What do I give to this guy? Or how do I make him feel special? It just so happens that as he's trying to deliberate here, Haman comes in from the courtyard, and King says, hey, Haman, come on over here. I need your help. Come on over here. What would I do to the person that I want to honor in the kingdom? Now, again, Haman's feeling pretty good about himself, so his answer is like, you know what? He's probably talking about me. He's probably thinking, I'm pretty good right now. So what does he do? He says, you should put on one of your robes, like one of the robes that you've already worn, King, and he should ride one of your horses, and he should be paraded around town and celebrated. And the king's like, that's a really good idea. I like that. Go do that for Mordecai. I imagine that was a pretty good reversal for Haman at that moment. He's like, oh, I love that guy. So, again, we start to see the reversal here. Mordecai is then paraded around town. Haman is the one to do it. He has to even proclaim, like, this is the guy who saved the king. He's so great. I love him. You guys all should love him too. Takes him back to the palace. Probably didn't feel too good about that, I bet. I wouldn't if I had, like, tried to BM someone and it flips back around on me. But either way, you know, it wasn't the best start to the day, but it could get better, you know. I'm going to hang my enemy. It's going to be great. What do we see next? Well, right after that, he goes straight from parading down to the second banquet that Esther is hosting. And at this second banquet, the king does the same type of thing. They enjoy food and then asks, all right, you want something. What is it? Tell me. I'll give it up to I'll give it up to like a half of your kingdom. Tell me what you want. And what does Esther reveal? Well, this time Esther reveals, I would like you to protect me. I want you to protect me. There's someone seeking to take my life, and I need your protection. And the king's like, wait, who's going after your life? Who would seek after my queen's life? And then she stands up and directly at Haman, points it right at Haman, says, that decree that you signed, I'm Jewish. That would wipe me out and all of my people. Could you help me, save me, take care of me? Now, finding out this rough news, the king reacts like probably most people would. He gets up, storms off, is a little angry. He's probably pretty drunk at this moment too, so I imagine that added to it. But after coming back, he makes a decision. He says, Haman, you got to go. I'm sick of you. You're trying to kill my queen. I don't know why you do that. Now, we don't think Haman knew this personal thing. He didn't know about Esther's heritage. Makes it all the more funny that it turns around in such a way. But what we see is the king's like, I want you gone. I want you taken away. And what they decide is they had just heard that, hey, there was a new gallows right outside of Haman's place. Ready to go. Let's send it right there. And so they take Haman and they put him right there. But the main conflict is still on the rise. there's still a decree, and you cannot undo a decree that the king has put a stamp on. So how are we going to work this out? Well, Esther, the king, and Mordecai come together, and they come up with this plan. They say, all right, so we can't undo this decree because it's already been sent out. But what if we send out another decree? And they say, well, we need to tell the Jewish people that they need to get ready to defend themselves. There's a lot of heat about to come their way, and they need to be ready to defend themselves, and it's okay that they defend themselves. It is by decree of the king that they can defend themselves. And so they write this up, they stamp it, and they send it out into the kingdom. And now, on the 13th of Adar, the Jewish people are ready to defend themselves. Again, another timeout. I can't imagine the type of situation, like how confused I would be if I just got a paper like a week ago that said, you know what, I don't know, all the college students, I'm sick of them. I don't want them anymore. Let's get rid of them. And then a week after that, we see another thing that goes through. College students, get ready to fight. What am I doing at that time? I don't know how I would go about that personally. It'd be a very chaotic situation, especially within a whole kingdom that you're having to deal with. There's not just there's pockets here and there. A very, very chaotic situation. I don't know how I deal with that. But what do we see? Well, the 13th of Adar comes. The Jewish people successfully defend themselves. They fend off the attackers. They give us actually somewhat specific numbers for how many people they had to fight off and defend themselves with. And so they're defended, but something really weird kind of comes up. And Esther realizes that, hey, that was a really good defense. What if we just kind of furthered that just a little bit? And so Esther goes to the king and says, hey, that was a pretty good day for us. What if we did it for one more day and take care of all the rest of the haters here in Susa? And they do that. The king says, yeah, sure, why not? And they end up hanging Haman's sons, 10 sons, all taken care of. Again, a very brutal situation. I feel like we see a lot of the details here, but we don't see what type of emotions were going through their head. Was there revenge on the mind? Was there hate towards people that had brought this forth? What were the people who didn't have hate for the Jews, what were they thinking? When your neighbor starts fighting one another, we don't know. But that's where we're left. That's what the book of Esther leaves us off. We see the Jews defending themselves, and then we see the elevation of chapter 10 ends with the elevation of Mordecai to number 2. So a brilliant story of seeing where we see a horrible situation start to rise. The halfway point, there's a reversal, and we're left where we were kind of at the beginning, where someone has been elevated up to the second place. And from there. We also see that on the 13th of Adar, the Jews separate a holiday called Purim. Purim named after the dice that they used to determine the day. Pur, which is dice. And that generally goes around February, March. Not too important to us, but it's interesting to think about on why. So this is where the book of Esther ends. We're left with these people who were possibly going to be wiped out, and then they defend themselves, and then I guess they're great up in the kingdom. They have more power. What's the point? I think as we read the word, a common strategy that I use when I get into the word is I look at it in the sense of, what does this word tell me about God, and what does this word tell me about mankind, about myself? Because ultimately, those are the two areas that it's going to be speaking to. What does it tell me about me, and what does it tell me about God? We're going to start with man because it's going to lead into God as well. So what does this story tell us about man? Because it's a cool story and all. I remember the VeggieTales story. It was an impactful one, whatever. But I'm not Jewish. I don't celebrate Purim. I don't live in a society that I could possibly be genocided in. Fingers crossed. We're not in Persia, right? I'm not in Persia, but if you think about it, we live in a society where proclaiming truth can catch quite a bit of flack if you were to go down to even just to the university and proclaim truth. You're going to catch a lot of flack from the people there. We may not live in a place that hangs people who annoy it on big sticks up in the sky. But we do live in a culture where larger companies and all that stuff will silence you for even having a word. Won't cut you off, they'll just make you quiet. And lastly, we're not living in a pagan society in the sense that we're worshiping thousands and thousands of deities. But we are living in a society that celebrates radical individualism as a sort of God. Now, under the guise of self-definition, we're told that we can administer death to children, that words in biology, they don't mean anything, that ultimately truth does not exist, that it's per person, now until it does exist, or until it does need to come forth. As much as you want to put a new coat of paint on this particular society, we can relate a lot as humanity to what the Jews were going from. If you think about it, it's a people who are a small and tight-knit community who are in a land that is not of their own, with a people that they may have some issues with, whether that be religiously or doctrinally, whatever. But what Esther shows us, particularly, at least from the mankind standpoint, is that we can show bravery. We can show immense courage and bravery in this type of society. We think how we may not understand fully, but how brave it was to try and come before the king, a king where if his emotions were not in the right place, he could axe you right then. We don't understand that to its fullest because that's not something we have to deal with now. But even if you were to loudly proclaim truth online and how much flack and messages, you'd be very popular for a little while, that's for sure. But what bravery we can show, because I feel like all too often, especially here in Oregon and in the western states, along with the East Coast, we see a lot of Christians conforming. We see a lot of us giving up what they know to be true for a lie because it's easier, because it's a lot, you're not going to catch as much flack. I can go to my day-to-day and not have to think about it. And when I think of even fundamental truths, obviously we have differences in denominations, all that good stuff. What I'm talking about primarily here is fundamental truths about reality. What does that mean? I'm talking about who God is, how broken we are, and how in need of Him we are. At the end of the day, we are dependent, and we are thankful for what God has given us even today, because what we deserve is death and separation. And Christians are giving that up and conforming to that. And what I'm saying is here, as Christians, understanding that, you know what? We cannot compromise on those particular truths. We cannot conform that. The world may try and say that I can find that in myself or in my people or in the government. But what this book shows us is that at the end of it, we need to have courage. We need to have courage. We need to have bravery. We need to be able to say what needs to be said. Man tries to write his own story, and when we try to write our own story, we completely miss the point that God is the one in control of this. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. God is in the control of this. Our lives revolve around the understanding that Christ is the one that has died for us, and He's allowed me this relationship with the Father, and that only through getting to know Him, abiding in Him, can we even understand who He is, get an idea of who God is. That's ultimately what it comes down to. It's an ultimate gift. And even the events that I have done, even the things that I feel like it's like, I could take credit for, God was working throughout all of that. And this is kind of where it transitions into what do we learn about man and what do we learn about God in this sense. In a story where we don't see God's name proclaimed, we got to go back to this initial question, where is God? Why is He not talked about? This is the book where He is the author. He is the one driving the events. He is the one working in each and every one of our lives. Why did he not say his name? Even the Jewish people, we see people who are Jewish by heritage, but we see them giving up particular things, conforming in some ways. What am I supposed to get out of that? What does this say about God? How can I know that he's even here? Has he abandoned the people at this time while they're in their exile? No. This is a case where God doesn't even need to proclaim his name, that we can tell he is the one working throughout this story. He is the one bringing forth all of these events. I think it's really important that as we understand that we don't understand the emotions and feelings that go throughout these people's minds. And I think there's a reason why that is. It's because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. God's going to use these broken people for his glorification. In this case, it was the protection of his people, his chosen people in this instance, that they may live another day so that his name be glorified. We always got to go back to what is the point of that. It's that his name be glorified daily in everything that we do. From the beginning of the Bible, we have seen that through every decision by him and every mistake of humanity, and even in the cases where we are actively rebelling against him, in every attempt, God has used that to glorify his name. And countless examples from the judgment by the Chaldeans, from the exile itself, all of that goes to glorify his name. From the promises delivered in the garden to the promises given to Noah and his descendants, all has been brought forth by his plan. There's not a week that goes by that we don't think of that. I mean, we think even a week ago, right? What were we celebrating? We were celebrating the coming of our Messiah. The continuation of what the Jews were looking towards, and a completion of what we now have. Here as people in the new covenant, we can have that peace and understanding, knowing that because of what he's brought forth, because of his ultimate plan, because of him, not because of me, we can have peace. Today in Esther, we saw a nation that's objectified its women, men that sought to obliterate a people, and main characters that had questionable morals and ethics at the very best. Yet throughout all of that, God is lifted up. He is elevated. I just pray that as we go from here, we let that truth reign in our minds. That the reason I can be brave, the reason that I can have courage in this moment, the reason that I can even face what the world is today, the reason I can wake up and be joyful is because he has a plan, because he is sovereign over all of this. No matter where I'm at, God is going to use that. Through mankind's travails, God will prevail. I pray that at that very, very basic, if you take nothing away from that, understand that through mankind's travails, that means efforts, problems, rebellion, all that stuff, God's will prevails. Would you pray with me? Father, I thank you for this day. Father, I pray that as we understand you and the amazing blessing it is that we even get to be here, Father, would we just grow in love of you, grow in love of what you've done and what you continue to do, and what you say you will do for us in the future, Father. We don't even have a full picture of what's to come, but we know it's glorious. And we can have peace in our daily lives, knowing that what is to come is greater than what I can imagine. Father, as we read through the book of Esther, would we see the characters, we'd see what goes on, would we see all the brokenness throughout all of this? But would we just see you? See you working in every bit and detail. Father, you are good, and your will is good, and we trust that. May it give us peace for this day. We thank you for this time, Lord. Your son's name we pray. Amen.